Denmark. Vesey was a literate, skilled carpenter and leader among African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina. He is notable as the accused and convicted ringleader of the Rising, a major potential slave revolt planned for the city in June 1822. He was executed. Likely born into slavery in St. Thomas, he served a master in Bermuda for some time before being brought to Charleston, where he gained his freedom. Vesey won a lottery and purchased his freedom at age 32. He had a good business and a family, but was unable to buy his first wife Beck and the children out of slavery. Vesey became active in the Second Presbyterian Church. In 1818 he was among the founders of an independent AIM church in the city, which had the support of white clergy. It rapidly attracted 1,848 members, making this the second largest AIM congregation in the nation after Mother Bethel in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In 1822 Vesey was alleged to be the ringleader of a planned slave revolt. Vesey and his followers were said to be planning to kill slaveholders in Charleston, liberate the slaves, and sail to the Black Republic of Haiti for refuge. By some accounts, it would have involved thousands of slaves in the city and others on plantations miles away. City officials had a militia arrest the plot's leaders and many suspected followers in June before the rising could begin. Not one white person was killed or injured. Vesey and 5 slaves were among the first group of men rapidly judged guilty by the secret proceedings of a city-appointed court and condemned to death. They were executed by hanging on July 2, 1822. Vesey was about age 55. In later proceedings, some 30 additional followers were executed. His son was also judged guilty of conspiracy and was deported from the United States, along with many others. The church was destroyed and its minister expelled from the city. Early life. Manuscript transcripts of testimony at the 1822 court proceedings in Charleston, South Carolina, and its report after the events constitute the chief documentation about Denmark Vesey's life. The court judged Vesey guilty of conspiracy in a slave rebellion and had him executed by hanging. The court reported that he was born into slavery about 1767 in St. Thomas, at the time a colony of Denmark. He was called Telemark. Historian Douglas Edgerton suggested that Vesey could have been of Coromantee origin. Biographer David Robertson suggested that Telemark may have been of Mande origin, but his evidence has not been generally accepted by historians. Telemark was purchased at about age 14 by Joseph Vesey, a Bermudian sea captain and slave merchant. After a time, Vesey sold the youth to a planter in French Saint-Domingue. When the youth was found to suffer epileptic fits, Vesey took him back and returned his purchase price to the former master. Biographer Edgerton found no evidence of Vesey having epilepsy later in life. He suggests that Vesey may have faked the seizures in order to escape the particularly brutal conditions on Saint-Domingue. Telemark worked for Joseph Vesey as a personal assistant and interpreter in slave trading, including periods spent in Bermuda, and was known to be fluent in French and Spanish in addition to English. Following the American Revolution, the captain retired from the sea and slave trade, settling in Charleston, South Carolina. Colonists from Bermuda had settled here since 1669, and there were many ties. Numerous Bermudians, such as Thomas Tudor Tucker, had settled prior to American independence. Telemark had learned to read and write by the time he and Vesey settled in Charleston. Charleston was a continental hub connected to Bermuda's thriving merchant shipping trade, the trading center of the Low Countries' rice and indigo plantations. The city had a majority slave population and thriving port. Vesey hired out Telemark as a skilled carpenter, and he joined other artisans, many of them free people of color who had their own community in the city. Freedom. On November 9, 1799, Telemark won $1,500 in a city lottery. At the age of 32, he bought his freedom for $600 from Vesey. He took the surname Vesey and the given name of Denmark, after the nation ruling his birthplace of St. Thomas, Denmark. Vesey began working as an independent carpenter and built up his own business. By this time he had married an enslaved woman. The children were born into slavery under the principle of partis sequitur ventrum, by which children of a slave mother took her status. Vesey worked to gain freedom for his family. He tried to buy his wife, but her master would not sell her. This meant the future children would also be born into slavery. Along with many other slaves, Vesey had belonged to the Second Presbyterian Church, and chafed against its restrictions on black members. In 1818 he was among founders of a congregation on what was known as the Bethel Circuit of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. This had been organized in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1816 as the first independent black denomination in the United States. The AIM Church in Charleston was supported by leading white clergy. In 1818, white authorities briefly ordered the church closed for violating slave code rules that prohibited black congregations from holding worship services after sunset. The church attracted 1848 members, making it the second largest AIM church in the nation. City officials always worried about slaves in groups. They closed the church again for a time in 1821, as the city council warned that its classes were becoming a school for slaves. Vesey was reported as a leader in the congregation, drawing from the Bible to project hope for freedom. Background. By 1708, the population of the colony of South Carolina was majority slave, reflecting the numerous African slaves imported to the state as laborers on the rice and indigo plantations. Exports of these commodity crops and cotton from the offshore sea islands produced the wealth enjoyed by South Carolina's planters. This elite class controlled the legislature for decades after the American Revolution. The state, the Lowcountry and city of Charleston had a majority of the population who were slaves of African descent. By the late 18th century, slaves were increasingly country-born, that is, native to the United States. They were generally considered more tractable than newly enslaved Africans. Connections of kinship and personal relations extended between slaves in the city of Charleston and those on plantations in the Lowcountry. Just as those connections existed among the planter class, many of whom had residences in both places. From 1791 to 1803, the Haitian Revolution of slaves and free people of color on Saint Domingue had embroiled the French colony in violence. Blacks gained independence and created the Republic of Haiti in 1804. Many whites and free people of color had fled to Charleston as refugees during the uprisings, and brought the slaves with them. In the city, the new slaves were referred to as French Negroes. Their accounts of the revolts and its success spread rapidly among Charleston's slaves. In the early 1800s, the state had voted to reopen its ports to importing slaves from Africa. This decision was highly controversial and opposed by many planters in the Lowcountry, who feared the disruptive influence of new Africans on the slaves. Planters in upland areas were developing new plantations of short staple cotton and needed workers, so the state approved the trade. The profitability of this type cotton had been made possible by the invention of the cotton gin. From 1804 to 1808, Charleston merchants imported some 75,000 slaves, more than were brought to South Carolina in the 75 years before the Revolution. Some of these slaves were sold to the uplands and other areas, but many of the new Africans were held in Charleston and on nearby Lowcountry plantations. Conspiracy. Even after gaining his freedom, Vesey continued to identify and socialize with many slaves. He became increasingly set on helping his new friends break from the bonds of slavery. In 1819, Vesey became inspired by the congressional debates over the status of Missouri since slavery appeared to be under attack. Vesey developed followers among the mostly enslaved blacks in the Second Presbyterian Church and then the Independent African Church. Its congregation represented more than 10% of the blacks in the city. They resented the harassment of city officials. Economic conditions in the Charleston area became difficult since an economic decline affected the city. In the year of 1820, Vesey and a few other slaves began to conspire and plan a revolt. In order for the revolt to be successful, Vesey had to recruit others and strengthen his army. Because Mark Vesey was a preacher, when he had recruited enough followers, he would review the plans of the revolts with the others at his home during the religious classes. Vesey inspired slaves by connecting the potential freedom to the biblical story of the delivery of the children of Israel from Egyptian slavery. In his 50s, Vesey was a well-established carpenter with his own business. He reportedly planned the insurrection to take place on Bastille Day, July 14, 1822. This date was notable in association with the French Revolution, which had first abolished slavery in Saint-Domingue. News of the plan was said to be spread among thousands of blacks throughout Charleston and for tens of miles through plantations along the Carolina coast. Within the black population was a growing upper class of free people of color or mulattoes, some of whom were slaveholders. Vesey generally aligned with slaves. Vesey held numerous secret meetings and eventually gained the support of both slaves and free blacks throughout the city and countryside who were willing to fight for his cause. He managed to organize thousands of slaves who pledged to participate in his conspiracy. By using intimate family ties between those in the countryside and the city, Vesey created an extensive network of supporters. His plan was to form first a coordinated attack from multiple sides on the Charleston Meeting Street arsenal. Once they secured the weapons, the conspirators planned to commandeer ships from the harbor and sail to Haiti, possibly with Haitian help. Vesey and his followers also planned to kill white slaveholders throughout the city, as had been done in Haiti, and liberate the slaves. According to records of the French consulate in Charleston, his group was reported to have numerous members who were French Negroes, slaves brought from Saint-Domingue by refugee masters. Failed uprising. Due to the vast number of slaves who knew about the planned uprising, Vesey feared that word of the plot would get out. Vesey reportedly advanced the date of the insurrection to June 16. Beginning in May, two slaves opposed Vesey's scheme. George Wilson and Joe LaRoche gave the first specific testimony about the coming uprising to Charleston officials, saying a rising was planned for July 14. George Wilson was a mixed-race slave who was deeply loyal to his master. The testimonies of these two men confirmed an earlier report coming from another slave named Peter Priolo. Though officials didn't believe the less specific testimony of Priolo, they did believe Wilson and LaRoche due to their unimpeachable reputations with the masters. With the testimony, the city launched a search for conspirators. Joe LaRoche had originally planned to support the rising and brought the slave Roller Bennett to discuss plans with George Wilson, his close friend. Wilson had to decide whether to join the conspiracy described by Bennett or tell his master that there was a plot in the making. Wilson refused to join the conspiracy and urged both LaRoche and Bennett to end their involvement in the plans. Wilson convinced LaRoche that they must tell his master to prevent the conspiracy from being acted out. The mayor, James Hamilton, was told, and he organized a citizens' militia, putting the city on alert. White militias and groups of armed men patrolled the streets daily for weeks until many suspects were arrested by the end of June, including 55-year-old Mark Vesey. As suspects were arrested, they were held in the Charleston workhouse until the newly appointed Court of Magistrates and Freeholders heard evidence against them. The workhouse was also the place where punishment was applied to slaves for the masters, and likely where plot suspects were abused or threatened with abuse or death before giving testimony to the court. The suspects were allowed visits by ministers. Dr. Benjamin Palmer had visited Vesey when he was sentenced to death. Vesey told the minister that he would die for a glorious cause. Court of Magistrates and Freeholders, as leading suspects were rounded up by the militia ordered by Intendant Mayor James Hamilton. The Charleston City Council voted to authorize a Court of Magistrates and Freeholders to evaluate suspects and determine crimes. Tensions in the city were at a height, and some residents had doubts about actions taken during the widespread fears and quick rush to judgment. Soon after the court began its sessions, in secret and promising secrecy to all witnesses, Supreme Court Justice William Johnson published an article in the local paper recounting an incident of a feared insurrection of 1811. He noted that a slave was mistakenly executed in the case, hoping to suggest caution in the Vesey affair. He was well respected, having been appointed as justice by President Thomas Jefferson in 1804. But his article appeared to produce a defensive reaction, with white residents defending the court and the militancy of city forces. From June 17, the day after the purported insurrection was to begin, to June 28, the day after the court adjourned, officials arrested 31 suspects, in greater number as the month went on. The court took secret testimony about suspects in custody and accepted evidence against men not yet charged. Historians acknowledge that some witnesses testified under threat of death or torture, but Robertson believes that their affirming accounts appeared to provide details of a plan for rebellion. Newspapers were nearly silent while the court conducted its proceedings. While bickering with Johnson, the court first published its judgment of guilt of dead Mark Vesey and 5 black slaves, and announced sentencing them to death. The 6 men were executed by hanging on July 2. None of the 6 had confessed, and each proclaimed his innocence to the end. The deaths quieted some of the city residents' fears, and the tumult in Charleston about the planned revolt began to die down. Officials made no arrests in the next 3 days, as if wrapping up the business. Concerns about proceedings. Learning that the proceedings were conducted in secret, with defendants unable to confront their accusers or hear testimony against them, Governor Thomas Bennett, Jr. had concerns about the legality of the court, as did his brother-in-law Justice Johnson. Bennett had served almost continuously in the state legislature since 1804, including 4 years as Speaker of the House. He did not take any action at first, because 4 of his household slaves were among those accused in the first group with Vesey, and 3 of these were executed with the leader on July 2. Bennett consulted in writing with Robert Y. Hayne, Attorney General for the state, expressing his concerns about the conduct of the court and the inability of defendants to confront accusers, yet be subject to execution. Hayne responded that slaves were not protected by the rights available to freemen of habeas corpus and the Magna Carta, under the state's constitution. Further arrest and convictions. On July 1, an editorial in the Courier defended the work of the court. After that, in July, the cycle of arrests and judgments sped up, and the suspect pool was greatly expanded. As noted by historian Michael P. Johnson, most blacks were arrested and charged after the first group of hangings on July 2. This was after the actions of the court had been criticized by both Justice William Johnson and Governor Bennett. The court recorded that they divided the suspects into groups. Those who exhibited energy and activity, if convicted, these were executed. Other men who seemed simply to yield their acquiescence to participating were deported. Over the course of 5 weeks, the court ultimately ordered the arrest of 131 black men, charging them with conspiracy. In July, the pace of arrests and charges more than doubled, as if to prove there had been a large insurrection that needed controlling. But the court found it difficult to get conclusive evidence. Quote, it noted in its report covering the second round of court proceedings that 3 men sentenced to death implicated scores of others when they were promised leniency in punishment. In total, the courts convicted 67 men of conspiracy and hanged 35, including Vesey, in July 1822. A total of 31 men were transported, 27 reviewed and acquitted, and 38 questioned and released. Vesey's family. The remainder of Vesey's family was also affected by the crisis and court proceedings. His enslaved son Sandy Vesey was arrested, judged to have been part of the conspiracy, and included among those deported from the country, probably to Cuba. Vesey's wife Susan later emigrated to Liberia, which the American Colonization Society had established as a colony for freed American slaves. Another son, Robert Vesey, survived past the end of the American Civil War to be emancipated. He helped rebuild Charleston's African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1865, and also attended the transfer of power when U.S. officials took control again at Fort Sumter. White involvement. On October 7, 1822, Judge Elihu Bay convicted 4 white men for a misdemeanor in inciting slaves to insurrection during the Denmark-Vesey slave conspiracy. These 4 white men were William Allen, John Ignatius, Andrew S. Rhodes, and Jacob Danvers. They were sentenced to varied fines and reasonably short jail time. Historians have found no evidence that any of these men was a known abolitionist. They do not seem to have had contact with each other or any of the plotters of the rebellion. William Allen received 12 months in prison and a $1,000 fine, which was the harshest punishment of the 4. When tried in court, Allen admitted to trying to help the slave conspiracy, but said that he did so because he was promised a large sum of money for his services. Reports from the judge show that the court believed that Allen was motivated by greed rather than any sympathy for the slaves. The other white conspirators' punishments were far more lenient than that of William Allen. John Ignatius was given a $100 fine and 3 months in prison, as was Jacob Danvers. Ignatius was found guilty of inciting slaves to insurrection, but Danvers was charged simply for saying that he disliked everything in Charleston, but the Negroes and the sailors. Danvers had said this publicly after the plot had been revealed. City officials thought his comment suspicious. Danvers was found guilty for showing sympathy to the slaves who had been caught trying to support the conspiracy. The final white defendant, Andrew S. Rhodes, received a sentence of 6 months and a $500 fine, although there was less evidence against him than any of the other whites. White residents of Charleston feared there could be more whites who wanted to help blacks fight against slavery. They were already concerned about the growing abolitionist movement in the North. which spread its message through the mails and via anti-slavery mariners, both white and black, who came ashore in the city. Judge Bay sentenced the 4 white men as a warning to any other whites who might think of supporting slave rebels. He also was pushing state lawmakers to strengthen laws against both mariners and free blacks in South Carolina in general, and anyone supporting slave rebellions in particular. Judge Bay thought these 4 white men were spared from hanging only because of a statutory oversight. The convictions of these men enabled the white men of the pro-slavery establishment to continue to believe that the slaves would not stage rebellions without the manipulation of alien agitators or local free people of color.